All right. So, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Midterm Conference on the Right to International Protection, a pendulum between globalization and nativization. My name is Idil Atak. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology, cross-appointed to the Faculty of Law at Ryerson University here in Toronto, Canada. I'm a member of the PROTECT research project, and you will shortly learn more about our research project. This conference is hosted by Ryerson University. At this university, we acknowledge that the land we live on is Indigenous land. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. Dish and One Spoon Treaty is between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As you have seen on the program, for this conference, we have a lineup of great speakers, and I hope you will find the discussions engaging and thought-provoking. Without further ado, I now have the great pleasure of inviting Professor Mohamed Lachemi, President and Vice Chancellor of Ryerson University, for the introductory remarks.
Good day all, and welcome to the PROTECT Midterm Conference. For making this event possible, I would like to thank Professor Idil Atak from our university here at Ryerson University, the PROTECT project lead, Hakan Hijakan, and the entire PROTECT research team. I would also like to express my thanks to the speakers and participants for joining us to discuss this critical topic. Refugee protection is a subject that is very important for me. I am the president of a university located in Canada's most multicultural city. Canada has a history of opening its doors to people in need, including in the last few years, refugees from Syria. But even here and in many other countries, there can be resistance to accepting refugees. As researchers and scholars, we have a responsibility to explain how immigrants and refugees benefit receiving countries and how they make those countries better for everyone. Education and information are the best tools we have to take on the nativism and discrimination we see in places such as North America or Europe and other places around the world. This conference comes at a moment when refugees are once again in the highlights. This time it is Afghanistan, and we're hearing the news this morning or today that people have, fortunately, few hours on the deadline to leave, and the big panic affecting everybody there. Thousands, and more likely tens of thousands of people are in danger. Getting them out of the country is the immediate challenge. What happens to those who find refuge and what kind of lives they will have in a long-term is a long-term challenge this conference can help address. But to find answers and support progress on refugees, we need research and scholarship. With that knowledge, fair and workable solutions are possible. This conference will be part of the answer. The PROTECT project is midterm. These discussions will help shape its future approach. That means having a role in protecting current and future refugees and building a better world. The time is now, and the opportunity to make change happen is in our hands. I wish you all the best for a wonderful conference, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, President Lashemi, for the welcome introductory remarks. We really appreciate you joining us this morning in Toronto. And now I would like to invite Dr. Hakan Sujakkan, the principal investigator of our research project, our fearless leader, to deliver his presentation.
Thank you very much, Idil. I would like to start by thanking President Mohamed Lashemi and the Ryerson University that he represents, and Professor Idil Atak for organizing this conference on behalf of the PROTECT Consortium. Everything seems to be perfect until now, and we are getting a lot of audience. The number is increasing, I see. So as the number of the audience increases, my level of enthusiasm and motivation increases as well. Thanks to the audience for joining us this morning in Toronto and this afternoon in Europe. My task in this talk is to give you a faint idea about the theory and conceptual framework that is behind this project, and that connects the different parts of our ongoing research. This is what we call a cleavage theory approach, which has originated from the University of Bergen in 1960s. The exponent for this approach was Professor Stein Rokkan. He was also the founder of this department and one of the founders of political science in Bergen, and one of the people who is behind the intellectual movement that moved social sciences from the essentialist approaches to structuralist and functionalist approaches, which were modern at that time. Giving protection to people who flee persecution, torture, and death is a human conduct that has existed throughout history. Historians are telling us that sanctuaries for such people existed in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and everywhere, actually. When we look at protection practices since ancient times, it is very tempting to say that giving protection to people who are in danger must be a human instinct. Protection from death and suffering has been carved into our minds as a natural right. In 1951, the Global Society made protection a universal legal right by coding it as international law. Since then, the Geneva Convention has saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Just look at the most current refugee situation. Tens of thousands are fleeing from Afghanistan. Millions had to leave Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda. The Czech and Hungarian dramas at the beginning of the Cold War should also be remembered. Finally, the root of all the roots, the human tragedies of the Second World War. All flows of refugees from these human dramas are about people who do not fit in our political and economic systems, who are seen as surplus people. These are about political elites who do not want parts of their population on their territory. They are also about global powers that want to reshape the world in order to create a more favorable political context for themselves. In other words, the global society, we create refugees all together. We have a share in the guilt all together by electing our leaders who pursue global power, who pursue national power at the expense of groups of people. The global conflicts about refugee protection show that we are becoming less and less willing to protect refugees. What we want to do in PROTECT is to discover ways of advancing the right to international protection in today's turbulent global political context. We have wars, we have conflicts between countries, we have many countries that do not want to receive refugees because they see them as a burden. Even our political talk about them uses phrases like burden sharing. In this context, it is a real challenge to protect refugees. And we want to find ways of doing this by looking at the problems in more realistic ways. The perspective of politics that derives from the notion of global cleavages is an effective way of depicting the turbulent political context that we are living in now. It is important to portray the global political context because global political cleavages have serious implications about who needs protection, who is a refugee, and how we can adequately respond to refugees' need for protection. This brings me to a short depiction of the global cleavage system and its implications for refugee protection. Earlier research have identified 4 or 5 groups in the global political cleavage system that are contesting with each other. And this contestation is affecting the rights of refugees or the implementation of international law in general. The 4 main groups are globalists, regionalists, nation statists, and nativists. Any kind of political or social actor can be in one of these groups. The point is that these cleavages are global, and people from different nations, from different continents can connect to each other by being part of a group that is in contest and contestation with other groups. For example, nativists. We have nativists in almost all Western societies, and nation statists as well, and regionalists like people who prefer regional unions like the European Union, and then globalists who want to have a global society, a solidaric global society in different ways. One of my tasks today is to convince you that we have these cleavages. This is the first thing that I will try to convince you. And the second thing that I need you to believe is that these cleavages affect our ways of seeing international protection and doing international protection. The European Public Sphere research. This is an article, this comes from an article that Raphael Heiberger and myself wrote 2 years ago, but it's being published now. We see that there are clear indications that nation statists, globalists, regionalists, and nativists are speaking within the European public sphere. This is the Facebook version of the data that we have, but other kinds of data have also been used, and the same groups have been detected in interview data covering many political elites and the traditional media data. We have for sure all these groups in all European societies. The green part here that you see are the nativists and nationalists and ethno-nationalists. They are talking more with each other on Facebook than with other groups. The blue and orange groups, these are human rights globalists. As you see, they are talking a bit more with each other, but almost with everybody as well. And the purple and yellow colors are represent the regionalists. In this case, since this data is about the European Union, these are the Europeanists. They are talking with each other a lot. If you want to see more about this analysis, you can find it in this article that will come soon. But the point here is that the data here does not represent anything about immigration. This is not about immigration. This is about who talks with whom, a networks of people, and who are these people who talk more with each other. Just by looking at the profiles of the organizations that talk with more with each other, we can see that these are mostly nativist organizations, anti-immigration groups, and etc. And this big round circle here is the European Commission. It is the entity that is communicating most with almost all transnational and national actors. There's the most activity and network density around it. So we have these 5 groups in the European Union, in European countries, at least as represented by Facebook. Because of time concerns, I didn't include other data that we had from other projects, but these data, as I said, these results that these 4 groups do exist are has been shown by other research as well. We looked at Facebook, but now we come to data, fresh data that we have collected from 26 countries in PROTECT. And we have also identified these groups among people who responded to our survey. This is a representative survey for each country. We had at least 1,000 respondents from each country, except the United States. We had 2,000 respondents from there because the country is big. What is interesting here is that the regionalist dimension merges with the nation statist dimension, and in some cases it merges with the globalist dimension. So you see all these ups and downs. For example, look at Austria. This is the picture that I had Austria before we collect data as well. Nativism is quite high, and nation statism, you see here the red, and globalism quite low. There are some surprises as well. You see a high degree of globalism in Romania and high degree of nationalism. It means that the main political conflict in Romania is going on between the nation statists and globalists. So countries have different profiles, but what is important here is that these 4 or 5 groups are in all countries. And these are the attitudes to the right to international protection. The pattern is quite similar to political cleavages among populations. These were measured with different variables, of course. They are not dependent on each other. And when we look at a simple regression between these two, we see that respondents' position in the global political cleavage system, whether he or she is a nativist, nation state, it's globalist, etc., is quite and is quite a strong determinant of support to international refugee protection. So this is solid data. This is solid result. We haven't yet analyzed the data in depth, but the data is so big, the data material is so big, and so many countries are included that there will not be much change in the analysis later when we analyze later. The explained variance is 32.3, which is quite high in any regression analysis before the country effect has been included in the analysis. Okay, so these graphs shows us that similar ideological groups are contesting in national politics. This means that although the strengths of the discourses are different in different countries, political cleavages are quite similar across countries. From a cleavage theory perspective, I don't think you have heard this definition of globalization before. From a cleavage theory perspective, this is political globalization. And more importantly, of course, public discourses and attitude to the right to international protection are strongly embedded in current global cleavage structure. So this means, what does this mean for our work with advancing the international refugee protection? This means that we have to learn more about this structure because we need to navigate within this political power structure if we want to implement, for example, the Global Compact on Refugees. From a legal perspective, you can make a law and expect that citizens and states are going to follow it, but this is not the case. Especially in international relations, we usually have a chaotic structure where states follow their own interests. And law, international law, is the second priority in many cases. The fact that refugee and asylum policies and institutions are increasingly more embedded in states' immigration policies is an obstacle for the implementation of the Geneva Convention and the Global Compact on Refugees. For example, take the latest proposal by the European Commission, the new pact on migration and asylum policy. The main concern there is actually to stop immigration into Europe. We have some papers about that coming as well. And the process of embedment has been going on since the end of 1980s, coinciding with the emergence of similar anti-immigration parties across Western democracies. This trend is spread globally through the diffusion of the global political cleavages into national politics. I think we can safely say, after seeing that data, the data from the 26 countries, we can safely say that the global political cleavage system is about to eradicate the national political cleavages that we have had since the state and nation buildings processes started in Europe and other places. Countries have had their own peculiar political cleavage structures on which party systems were based, on which political contestation was based. But now this new global political cleavage system is diffusing and standardizing the political cleavage systems across the world, which is again important to take into consideration if one wants to implement the Refugee Convention and the Global Compact on Refugees. So a successful implementation of the Convention and the Global Refugee Compact is possible only through knowledge of how to navigate among the strong groups and their preferences within the global political cleavage system. In order to achieve this goal, we are aiming to identify the sets of protection tools and policies preferred by different actors in the global cleavage system. The actors are UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, etc., and states, of course, and transnational organizations, NGOs, all actors that are involved in international politics and international protection. And the protection tools, by protection tools, I mean norms, governance modes, and discourses that are used to protect refugees. And PROTECT will further assess how these tools have worked in refugee protection before in different contexts and by using the cleavage theory, and it identifies the best performing norms, governance modes, and discourses. And it further tests the performance and resilience of these tools with respect to citizens' acceptability. Will the citizens accept this? The statistics that I showed concerning the surveys in 26 countries was about this. Which kinds of policy tools are acceptable to which kinds of citizens, and what is the role of global cleavages in forming their opinions about refugee protection. And of course, performance test is about how different tools have performed in the past in different contexts. Cleavage pressure test. We are identifying political cleavages in both social media and traditional media, and almost the whole world, more than 44 countries actually, and we are going to look at what kind of discursive pressure we can expect to different policy tools that can be found as performing the best in our research. And of course, crisis tests, the most important is the COVID test, and we are looking at whether the best performing policies and tools will also perform or have also performed well during the COVID crisis. And of course, some economic and political and mass migration crisis as well. This brings me to the end of my talk. This was rather a general, a very faint description of what we are trying to do in this project. Today and tomorrow, the project researchers will deepen all these things and add to these things, and you can just look forward to the new findings that we have during this conference. Thanks again for coming here, and this is the end of my talk. Thanks for watching.
Thank you so much, Hakan, for your presentation. Very inspiring, and we're looking forward to the next panel because we will have the opportunity of learning more about the findings of the PROTECT affiliated researchers. I would like to now give the floor to Dario Mazzola, who will be chairing our next panel.
Thank you very much, Idil. Thank you for the kind introduction, but especially thank you for the impressive work you and the team composed of Ryerson, Yona, and Zainab, but also Marilyn Daide have put into this conference for about 1 year. I am privileged to chair this session of presentation of the work package preliminary results and research framework, in addition to what has already been done very thoroughly by Professor Hakan Sijakan. And I also have the ungrateful task of managing the time. I have to ask you to please be very strict. We only allotted 5 minutes to each work package presentation, and every 2 presentations, we have 10 minutes for the question time. If we save some time, if we close earlier, we will have an extra time for question before the end of this session in 1.5 hours. So please be strict now, and maybe we can rescue some interesting conversation at the end. I also remind you that we have videos which are already online, very exciting and extremely effective one in communicating our project activities. In case you haven't watched them, please do so. This conference is just the tip of the iceberg. Please give a look to our website. And without further ado, I'm privileged to give the floor to Professor Elspeth Geil and to Professor Jürgen Bast, who are the co-leader and will present about the legal analysis in the work package 2 research of our project. Thank you very much. Elspeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And Idil, Hakan, Dario, this is a wonderful project. And we're at the halfway point, having produced an enormous amount of research, analysis, information already about the question of refugees and refugee protection, particularly in the context of the UN Compact for Refugees, which, as you will all remember, was adopted at the end of 2018. Pretty universal acceptance by all of the countries in the General Assembly, with the exception of the United States, of course, and a couple of other outliers. And the second compact, which was adopted, the Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, which was adopted with marginally greater numbers of states which were outliers, sadly to say, many of them in the European Union. In our work package, we've been looking at law and refugee protection in law, particularly in the context of cleavage theory, which Hakan has been explaining to you, and how that plays out in the European context. Our framework is the European Union, and what we're trying to uncover is how does the adoption of 2 new international instruments, which are specifically stated to be non-legally binding, impact national law, and in the context of the European Union, regional law in respect of refugee protection. We're working very closely with Idil and her team in Canada, and Joe Verley, who you're going to hear from soon in South Africa. And we're looking at how perhaps what Hakan would call the internationalists, who are the supporters in all of our areas, have sought to use the compact to push forward rights in access to acceptable healthcare of good quality, limitations on the use of immigration detention, and access to procedures including asylum. And we've had a number of fora, expert fora, the third of which will take place shortly in Gießen in Germany, And I will hand over now to Jürgen Bast of the University of Gießen to tell us more about that.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, also for sticking to the time. Please remember also to ask the questions on the Padlet. You find the links on the conference website. I forgot to say that before. Thank you again. And Jürgen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's only, I would only like to add a few remarks since Elspeth has perfectly presented the common work in Work Package 2. I would like to mention that we specifically focus on the Global Compact for migration and its impact on refugee protection. That might be surprising at first glance because there is also the Global Compact on refugees, but we are of the opinion that this general compact that refers to migrants may be of huge impact on protection-seeking migrants as well. In the forthcoming month, we'll have a series of expert fora, which will particularly look into the international protection regimes and how these non-binding documents may have an impact on strengthening the rights of protection-seeking migrants. In a more internal setting, we will discuss with various stakeholders, including persons working in Geneva, on implementing and reviewing the Global Compact for migration. And we look into the structural conditions that enables these non-binding documents to have an impact on the actual global governance of migration, among which the involvement of civil society actors may be the most important structural condition. I'll leave it with that and refer you to the more detailed presentation, which you find in the relevant video. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bast. Thank you again, Professor Geil. You've also been extremely quick. Our communication coordinator has posted the link to the Padlet in the chat, so you can go directly there to post your question, and I will report them to the panel. She also posted the link to subscribe to this expert fora, which has just been mentioned. They will also be very rich events, so please give a look to that. And in the meanwhile, we can proceed with our second presentation. And as I said, the question time will be later on. So we proceed with Work Package 3.
I am Francesca Longo, co-leader of the Working Package 3, together with Frank Castiger. So I will present a Working Package 3, on behalf of Frank, but also on behalf of the University of Ghent, Bergen, Witwatersrand, and Ryerson University, which are working with us in our in reaching our task. The main task of the Working Package 3 is to assess the impact of the Global Compact on a specific aspect of the governance of international protection, the effect of different national institutional architectures on the quality of national decision-making on refugees and asylum applications. We are investigating on which could be the institutional architecture that at the national level may be influential in achieving a high standard of protection in asylum policy. Our hypothesis is that institutional first instance setup matters. We are analyzing the first instance institutional organization in Europe, South Africa, and Canada from 1975 to 2020, with specific focus on the asylum officers or asylum units, with their position within the national organization organization and with specific attention to their autonomy from politics, because our idea is that the most independent from politics asylum officers are the highest performance in terms of human rights and refugee protection they could perform. Some preliminary findings, we detected a high level of difference of recognition rate among our case studies, and a difference in the category of protection. People coming from asylum seekers coming from the same countries are granted with asylum protection in some receiving countries and with the subsidiarity protection in other receiving countries. Why? Our idea is that the institutional setup is the independent variable. So we are conducting a qualitative and quantitative analysis. Diachronic qualitative analysis of institutional setup is the independent variable that should explain why there are these differences among recognition rate and kind of protection. Further dimension, the external dimension of the EU migration and asylum policy intended as the inclusion of transit and origin countries in the EU management of migration and asylum. It's important because in our idea, the way in which the European Union is conducting these external dimension is reducing the number of applications without reducing asylum pressure. ED are reducing asylum application as a result of the content of the agreement with origin and transit countries. We are mapping, classifying and analyzing agreements between EU and third countries. We selected 9 different classes of agreements. We are inserting these agreements in a data set with multiple variables in order to permit us a multivariate analysis. We built a visual interactive map in order to go behind, to go deeper. Yes, I'm going to conclude. To go deeper in bilateral agreement. Some preliminary findings for concluding. The most part of this agreement are non-binding instruments reached through intergovernmental method with the specific focus on return policy, border controls, fights against irregular migration. And we are detecting also agreements in the framework of development policy, which we are discovering as a sort of backdoor of external dimension. So I have not enough time to go deeper, but I will invite you to attend tomorrow the panel of our working package chaired by Frank Kasteker, in which Eva Ecker by Ghent University, Pierre Volgen by University of Bergen, and Krajak Damian Smith from Ryerson University will go in more details for our working package. And Frank and me are available for your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Longo. Exactly 5 minutes. I don't see any question for now in the Padlet. Maybe you can ask them here in the chat as well. I'd also remind you to follow us on Twitter. Our communication people are tweeting as we speak, and you are most welcome to do the same if you find some interesting sentences in what has been said so far. I found all these presentations to be very promising of what will happen tomorrow as well. So remember to check the panels tomorrow also. And now it's the time for questions. So you can either ask them on Padlet as I'm checking it, or type them here as you prefer. Any question to work package 2, the legal analysis, and work package 3, which has been just illustrated by Professor Longo and worked on, led by Professor Longo and Kasteker. Question on these work packages are welcome. I see one question. Yes, we have a question for Professor Giles. I'm reading it if that's okay. Do you have preliminary views on the impact of the pandemic on the GCR, in particular the upcoming high-level meeting and associated pledges? You can also see in the Q&A session, Professor Giles.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that the COVID pandemic has been revelatory in many different respects, in respect of refugee protection, but also more widely in terms of how we define ourselves as communities. In the European Union, I think it has come as a shock to many of us that, for instance, irregular migrants and asylum seekers have suddenly been defined within an area which is geographically bounded and no, you must not leave it because you're under COVID restrictions, and everyone is subject to the same rules with, in many cases, the same access to vaccines, whereas citizens have not been able to return to their own country. And here we see a transformation of our understanding of what citizenship is. We see a tremendous transformation of who are participants within our local communities. And we have an extremely counterintuitive result of how we see our world redefining, which has many dangers, as well as, of course, many opportunities in it.
Thank you very much for the answer, Professor Giles. I see it was asked by the Asylum project and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Thank you also for the question. Any other question regarding work package 2 and 3? Of course, you're most welcome. We have time to elaborate a bit on what I made you say very briefly. So please, Professor Bast.
Well, just one addition to what Elspeth has just said, that the access to health services may be actually one important example where migrants, protection-seeking migrants in particular, can rely and claim a commitment made by states in the Global Compact for Migration. We have objective, if I recall it correctly, number 14, which reads that states have committed to ensure that all migrants, regardless of their migration status, can exercise their human rights through safe access to basic services. So, although this is not a legally binding commitment, it's a politically binding commitment, and it's very important that it's not depend on your status that you must have access to basic services such as health services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bast. I see that on Padlet we also have a question from Anna Triandafilo, if I pronounce it decently. If not, I beg your pardon, Anna. If I can read the question, you see it in the chat also. Given that the compacts, and this is I'm quoting the question, given that the compacts are not binding documents, can we think of some follow-up that will make parts of them binding and in that sense more impactful? It is clear that their impact is more political and setting off a process of consultations and networking that is important, but what could be legal avenues to ensure a higher impact on the protection of fundamental rights? I guess this is especially addressed to Work Package 2 once again.
I'll be happy to start on that. I think that what the Global Compact has done, and in particular the Global Compact, the Marrakesh Compact on migration, is that it has challenged states on what the difference is between political commitments of their leaders at the UN, including, for instance, Angela Merkel, but also the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who confirmed that UK law is in conformity with the Global Compact and legal requirements. Now, I do not think we are going to transform, and I don't think anyone in the international community would say that we are in the process of transforming the compacts into law as such. But what we are seeing is a tremendous challenge to our legal orders at the national level to interpret national law in compliance with the political commitments that our leaders made. And therefore, national law remains the threshold, but insofar as national law can be interpreted in an expansive manner to include the commitments which our leaders made politically in the compacts, that must be the preferred interpretation, both for our national officials who are administering it, for our national judges who are deciding the law, and of course, for our refugees, our migrants, and all of those NGOs who worked for them.
May I add some words on this topic? So thank you. As a scholar of, as researcher of international relations, I am considering the Global Compact, both Global Compact, as a step for a new, for the entrance of new topics in the global agenda. I mean, migration is the first time that migration is in some way recognized as a global problem, and it's the first time that an official document, even if not binding, is considered in some relevant way. And this is the starting point for a global policy. So it could be the first step towards a more binding system of rules. So I suppose that this could be the first step, and could be the first step also for the revision of the regime on asylum protection, which is embedded in old rules stated in the past, and that now need to be reviewed.
I would like to support what Francesca has just said, also from a legal point of view. Actually, I'm not quite sure whether I would agree to the premise of the question made by posed by Anna, that legally binding commitments under international law are actually always more effective than non-binding commitments. General theory from international law does not necessarily support that assumption. Rather, the means of checking compliance and the review institutions and procedures, including the involvement of civil society actors in such review procedures, might be much more important than the distinctions between soft law and hard law. That is to say, a soft law instrument with effective review procedures attached might be more effective than a hard law commitment lacking such review and compliance checking procedures.
Thank you very much to Professor Bast also for the answer, and thank you, Anna Triantafillidou. Professor Triantafillidou will speak tomorrow at the academic plenary forum, so we are welcome to listen her talk tomorrow. And also Madeleine Garlick, who posted another question, the last we have time to answer in this Q&A, will representing UNHCR, will also present tomorrow at the plenary policy forum. So I also warmly invite you to be present tomorrow for their talks. If I may read the question, some critics have argued that the compacts have the potential to undermine respect for binding legal norms. Do you have any reflections on this based on the work so far? Thank you, Madeleine Garlick, for this very deep question. And whomever wants to answer, we still have some time to do so.
I I think that the fear of the undermining of the existing norms is perhaps overstated, and is overstated by perhaps those who are less than delighted by the existing standards of international law which exist. Both compacts make it very clear that they seek to provide more detail. They are all based on international law, international standards, and in particular, those international legal standards which are contained in the body of human rights treaties referred to in the preambles, but also to the existing implementation and the principles of legality, non-discrimination, and non-regression. Now, the principle of non-regression comes from the Marrakesh Compact, but as a principle of international law, it is equally applicable to the Compact on Refugees. And it is an enormous step forward. How can one possibly claim, if a state is bound by the principle of non-regression, that the compacts can be used as a mechanism to undermine and to set standards which are below those which already exist? The non-regression principle means that states must build on their existing laws, increase them as necessary to fulfill new requirements, but can never diminish standards.
Thank you very much, Professor Geil. We unfortunately have to move on. We have 2 extra questions on the Padlet, which will hopefully be answered by our experts in the next hours or days. Now we have to continue with the presentation from work package 4, the anthropological work package. Presenting their fieldworks are Professor Jacobsen from Bergen University and Professor Joe Verry from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from South Africa. I'm Joe Verry. I'm the director of the African Center for Migration Society at Wits University, where I'm working as co-lead on Work Package 4. Work Package 4, for those of you who've had a chance to see the video, is looking at the impacts of the global compacts on the governance of international protection. So the Work Package 4, our key objectives are to map how various actors collaborate to address and reduce vulnerabilities in the context of migration. And in particular, we're interested in looking at governance at the ground level to see how intersections with forms of domination or exclusion, particularly related to gender and legal status, are playing out in the field. We are secondly investigating how different actors and stakeholders in this field level governance understand notions of vulnerability and the needs that come with that. And so Christine is going to speak to this in a moment, but this for us is one of the key parts of the work package, whereby exploring how the concept of vulnerability is being understood, applied, and read by different actors. And through this, being able to then assess the ways in which the global compacts are impacting or undermining or supporting the application of the idea of vulnerability and the idea of special needs in field level governance of international protection. So the project involves ethnographic fieldwork, initially planned as participant observation, interviews, and exploration of collaborative research methods across the various research sites that you can see on the screen. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented challenges, potentially some opportunities to the original planned fieldwork, where we have been faced with the challenge of how to undertake ethnographic research online and in different ways. As a result, different parts of the fieldwork are taking place in different ways depending on the local country contexts. I'm now going to move to Christine, who is going to share with you some of our key findings and insights to date.
Thank you, Joe. So while the concepts of vulnerability and specific needs have acquired growing importance in policy discourses on migration and refugee protection, they remain contested and their practical relevance remains unclear. The field-level governance actors that we map in Work Package 4 participate in various ways in identifying, assessing, measuring, comparing, monitoring, and addressing vulnerability and specific needs. We have just started to analyze how various actors understand and operationalize these notions, but let me nevertheless point to some topics that are emerging. First, vulnerability and specific needs work as filtering devices in migration and refugee governance on the ground. These concepts and their operationalization justify the restriction of some rights and services to those identified as particularly vulnerable, thus allowing for more restrictive policies towards so-called non-vulnerable or less vulnerable persons, and for authorities to manage the structural shortage of budgetary funding allocated to reception conditions of asylum seekers. Second, tensions between different actors' understandings of vulnerability and specific needs occur on the ground. Such tensions can be, for instance, between categorical or group-based and more situational understandings of vulnerability. Whereas the former identifies and prioritizes, for instance, women and minors, the latter focuses on how, for instance, unequal access to resources and recognition in the reception context exacerbates vulnerability, thus responsibilizing states for the production of conditions of vulnerability. It remains to be seen to which extent such tensions mirror the political cleavages that Hakan presented earlier. Third, migrants question the meaning of vulnerability and the ways it is operationalized. In Marseille, for instance, where I do my field work, a self-organized group of asylum seekers organized a march challenging the authorities to take responsibility and respect the rights of asylum seekers. Indeed, beyond the denunciation of the French non-reception policy, these asylum seekers questioned the very relation of rights and duties between the state and so-called vulnerable people seeking protection. Fourth, COVID-19 is affecting understandings and ways of addressing vulnerability. The pandemic has led to a new focus on access to healthcare for non-citizens. It has brought to the fore vulnerabilities related to the precarious living conditions of migrants and asylum seekers. The pandemic has to a large extent exacerbated these conditions, as have measures to contain the pandemic through, for instance, border closures and encampments. So what then about the impact of the global compacts on how vulnerability and specific needs are understood and addressed on the ground? While it is too early to assess, we're still early on in our fieldworks and our analysis, our provisional data suggests that de facto forms of governance are not always aligned to the formal global governance architecture. In some contexts, the global compacts are not at all a reference point for vulnerability assessments, collaboration, and governance at the local level, while they appear to be more present in others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Veri and Jacobsen, also for minding the time, which is tyrannical, we say in Italy. And unfortunately, I know you would have a lot more to say. Hopefully, we will have the time either later or in these days. I now have to move on to Work Package 5, the Serving of Civil Society Organization, and Professor Simon Sherwood from the Open University talking. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dario. As Dario says, Work Package 5 is looking at the role of civil society organizations who are really seen as key actors in the operationalization of policy, and who have an agility which allows them to do things that state level actors are not able to do. So picking up on the question in the chat from Chioma about states where refugees' rights and migrants' rights are not being respected, CSOs might be part of the way in which we can help to understand and improve the situation for those individuals. So we're currently in the middle of collecting work, a survey of CSOs in a large number of countries, which matches on to work package 6 and 7. And in terms of what we are seeing at the moment, I think the key points are that the ecosystem of these groups is very significant and in some countries very substantial. And there is a good demonstration of the value of the theoretical approach that Hakan was presenting at the start of the event, particularly in terms of the correlation between groups that hold globalist or regionalist attitudes are ones which are much more likely to engage in direct action to support refugees and migrants. So in that sense, we're seeing how the theory is working in practice. And clearly that matches on to the work that was just been talked about with work package 4. And there are some overlaps there that we'll be looking to develop as we go along. As far as the global compacts go, I think the message at the moment is that while there's a generally good awareness of the global compact on migration, the global compact on refugees remains much less well known. But in both cases where these organizations have an understanding or visibility of those compacts, they have pushed for closer involvement and engagement in the development and refinement of those compacts. And typically what we're seeing is that groups that are best informed about the compacts are ones that are pushing most strongly for more rigorous provisions. So again, touching on some of the points that we were talking about in the previous discussion. So in terms of take-homes, I think it's 3 key points. Firstly, that we need to have a clear sight of CSOs within the landscape of refugee migration policy, and that they need to be taken into consideration. Secondly, that they are potential and effective partners, that they have a flexible and targeted capacity to make a difference on the ground. And then finally, I think we have to recognize that these groups are agents of change, that they are advocates for a more rigorous, more substantial policy at the national and international level, and that over time, I think their significance and their value will grow. I'll stop there and hand back to Dario.
Thank you very much, Simon, also for sticking to this very strict timing. We now have time for questions. I see one question has been asked by Shioma, if I don't mispronounce it. I hope not. And I'm pasting it in the chat and reading it as well. What does PROTECT hope to achieve with the findings of the research, especially in countries that disregard migrants and refugees' rights? Extremely thorny and difficult question, but very relevant one. I guess it's more general, but especially addressed to work package 4, perhaps, as it was asked during the presentation by Professor Jacobsen and Very. So, but anyone is welcome to jump in, to begin with them, of course.
I mean, thanks for the question. I think across all of the work packages, individuals are, involved in this form of research with the ambition of generating evidence to affect some form of change to improve the conditions in which individuals seeking protection are experiencing. But obviously, I think none of us are naive to the fact that, evidence and improved evidence and new evidence doesn't equate in a straightforward way at all to positive change. And I think it is something that, that's part of what PROTECT is exploring, is the ways in which the politics of policymaking, the politics of governance is playing out both at the local level and in global spheres. I think in a context like South Africa, where we know we sit in a very particular sort of tense time with issues around anti-foreigner sentiments, around xenophobia, all of which has been amplified by the COVID pandemic, as has been the case globally, impacts on both citizens and non-citizens alike, which is creating an even more difficult political terrain to engage with. But through the ways that the research has been developed, the partnerships that we have at the local level, our engagement in forums with government stakeholders, international organizations, community organizations, and so forth. So importantly, engaging with communities seeking protection. There is the hope that there is that platforms and processes that build on years of work preceding the PROTECT project can be used to try and affect some of those engagements. But I think that we are all very aware it's not a simple, straightforward pop in for a few years on a research project. And there's a big legacy that needs to be recognized and engaged as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Very. If someone else wants to comment on the question.
Yeah, I think I just would add that I think what we see, I think that the take home that I've seen from our work is that states are not hegemonic actors in this field, and there is space for non-state action, and in some cases very considerable non-state action. And I think we've seen that in several of the Work Package 4 cases, but more generically, we've seen it across the board that the non-state groups that are involved in some cases have some pretty significant resourcing behind them. They have a degree of agility and responsiveness that is not available to states. And so I think when we're thinking about the public debate, just as Hakan was highlighting the diversity of attitudes within public opinion and political debate, so too that creates spaces for a variety of actions. So I think when we're thinking about this area of policy and of the implementation of policy, I think we have scope for a more pluralistic kind of approach, which creates some potential for some effective support that might otherwise not be present. So I think it's about appreciating that breadth of opportunity that exists and which is taken up in different ways across different countries.
Thank you very much, Professor Asherwood. Professor Sijakan also noticed that the long answer to this question is available in the policy brief #1, and I pasted the link in the chat. Otherwise, you can again refer to the PROTECT website and find these and other policy briefs and preliminary results from our research. You are most welcome to do that as well. In the meanwhile, we move on to the presentation on Work Package 6 on the impact of the Global Refugee Compact and Global Migration Compact on the citizens' recognition of the right to international protection. And we have Dr. Pierre van Vollegem from the University of Bergen presenting it. And you can also watch the video by Professor Cornelius Kapelen about it online. Pierre, the floor is yours.
The objective of WP, The objective of WP6 is to examine the factors that affect citizens' attitude to the right to international protection. And we do that through conducting an international comparative survey that is based on 3 different phases: the design of the survey, its fielding, and then the analysis of the data, which is where we're at the moment, and which is what I'm going to insist on in this presentation. So very briefly, the survey comprises 3 components. I'm going to focus on the third one, which is basically the attitudes towards responsibility, sharing, and asylum matters. Some element of context: the survey comprises 26 countries in Europe and beyond. We have at least 1,000 respondents for each country and a bit more for the US. The data has been delivered in late July, so we don't have any final results, but we do have some preliminary analysis, which is what I'm going to show you right now through a selection of 2 questions. The first one is basically a survey experiment on preferences relating to responsibility sharing. And so this is the question. I'm not going to read it all out loud, but I'm just going to summarize it and say that the question would be: assume that your country is reallocated 100 new applicants but your country is also given the opportunity to pay a financial solidarity instead of accepting the applicants. And the respondents are presented with two different options. The first one is to accept the applicants, and the second one is to pay a financial contribution. For the financial contribution, we have three groups of respondents. For group A, the amount that is proposed is 5,000 euros. Then the amount for group B is 50,000 euros. And the amount for group C is 250,000 euros. And the responses that we get are as follows. So we see that a majority of the respondents would rather accept the applicants, irrespective of the amounts. But we see that the willingness to pay instead of accepting the applicants tend to decrease with the amount presented. For instance, if the respondents are presented with the options of either accepting or paying out their responsibility for 5,000 euro, 44.6% of the respondents would pay a contribution, financial contribution, instead of accepting the applicants. And you see that on the, I think you see my pointer now, and you see that this decreases with the amounts that we have. But this is a very summary statistics, and it hides variation across countries. If you look more into details, we see, for instance, here we have Norway and Slovenia. In Norway, a majority of the respondents would rather accept the applicants, but the willingness to pay out decreases mildly with the amount presented. So the higher the amount, the less people are willing to pay out their way, but still it decreases quite mildly. Whereas in Slovenia, this is a bit different. A minority of the respondents would rather accept the applicants if the amount is lower, but the willingness to pay decreases quite steeply with the amount presented. And this goes on with different countries, different situations. Here we have Czech Republic and Hungary, which are two of the Visegrad 4 countries. So allegedly most opposed to asylum and responsibility sharing. And we see here, for instance, that they would rather, like a large majority of respondents would rather pay money instead of accepting refugees. Another question that is quite interesting in our survey regards the most serious mistake that the authorities could make when they evaluate asylum applications. And here the question we ask is, it can sometimes be difficult for the authorities to know with certainty whether an asylum seeker actually meets the conditions for being granted asylum. This can lead to two types of mistakes. Either the asylum seeker who meets the condition is not granted asylum, or the asylum seeker who does not meet the condition is granted asylum. And so we have a scale, yes, I'll get there, thank you, Dario. And then we have a scale of response that ranges from false negative is the most serious mistake to false positive is the most serious mistake. And here we have quite interesting results. So first of all, a large share of the respondents stand in the central area, in the neutral area, which is basically that the two kinds of mistakes are equally serious. We have also 36.5% that think that the failure to grant asylum to those who meet the conditions, failure to grant asylum to those who meet the conditions is more serious, and 23.9% think that wrongly granting asylum is more serious. So there are many ways to explain this. We're not there yet. So I'm just going to show you this little graph in which we compare responses on this question to self-placement on the left-right spectrum. We see that there seems to be quite a difference with people on the left more think that it is more serious not to grant asylum, whereas people from the right tend to be either neutral or towards granting asylum when not deserved is worse. Yeah, so this is a difference that we still need to look into. It's very preliminary results at the moment, because if you look at the actual magnitude of the effect, so-called effect, is quite slow. So there is a lot of work to do, a lot of possible interesting results that we still have to look into. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Van Vollegem. We already have a question, but we will answer this after the next presentation, which is the presentation about Work Package 7 on the impact of the Global Refugee Compact and Global Migration Compact on the recognition of the right to international protection in the public sphere. And the presentation is by Professor Anna Maria Ducea Segestern from Lund University and Boris Panche from the University of Ljubljana. The floor is yours for the last presentation, and then we have time for returning to the questions and the general question time.
So I'm going to refer to the complex video that we already have posted on the PROTECT homepage for the details. Here, I just want to use my very brief time to summarize what we have found so far in our analysis of traditional and social media discourses about refugees, migration, the United Nations, Global Compact, and the role of the EU. And I will basically go through the traditional media first and cover social media afterwards. Looking at the traditional media findings, which is based on data collected by the University of Ljubljana through their event registry tool, during the period 2014-2019, about 2% of the total news coverage in newspapers and other traditional media channels across 18 countries was dedicated to the topic of refugee migration, the United Nations, and so on. So about 2% coverage. However, this was not an even coverage. This was definitely varying in terms of frequency of mentions by or in proportion to real world events. And while some events generated increased coverage in several countries at the same time, for example, across several European countries, the September 2015 migration wave got a lot of intense coverage. Some others were discussed only in one country. For example, in Greece, the September 2015 did not get a lot of coverage, whereas the subsequent waves that more directly affected the Greek context increased the coverage significantly. Also wanted to hint that the United States is a very interesting case because their frequency of coverage and the topics that they discuss are very particular to the United States. So they seem to deviate from any kind of global discourse. They see migration only through, let's call it, the national lens. So they cover issues connected, for example, with the Trump administration policies or the intensity of migrants coming from Central and South America towards the United States. Moving on, and this is a hint to the presentation that will take place tomorrow, and I warmly invite you to listen to the presentation by Sarah Schmidt and Raphael Heiberger from the University of Stuttgart on more details on this. Analysis of two countries, Germany and the UK, and their newspaper and news agency reports over the same period as before. Wanted to check the presence of global cleavages as presented earlier today by Hakan, and to understand in which way these global cleavages are present in this media discourse. And to summarize the findings, again, I sent you to that future presentation for more details. The most prevalent type of discourse was the human rights globalist discourse across the media channels and in both cases. And the least prevalent, again, across the board, was the nativist discourse. In the UK, the nativist discourse was slightly more frequent compared to Germany, but only slightly so. In terms of the ideology of the newspapers covered, it seemed that left-leaning newspapers were slightly more likely to adopt the human rights globalist discourse, but again, the differences are rather small, which is interesting to see that there is a certain human rights-oriented discourse that dominates traditional media. Moving on to the social media discourse, we focused so far on Twitter messages, even though we have data about some other social media platforms, which we will discuss in future papers. We covered 9 countries for which we had more data, and we wanted to look at how the discourse is Europeanized or not. And one of the conclusions that we can draw on the basis of our data is that indeed the migration discourse in the European public sphere on Twitter is Europeanized. In other words, the accounts tweeting in both vernacular languages and in English interact quite a lot with each other. Very interesting, and definitely talking a lot to the findings that Simon presented a bit earlier. A lot of the Europeanization, so to say, is done by ordinary citizens, not by politicians, nor by CSOs. So it's interesting to see where the CSOs are placed in this. The most shared English language content, the one that kind of connects these various accounts, comes, interestingly enough, from alternative media sources, sort of blogs and digital news channels, and most of these seem to propagate a negative view on migration. The national discourses on Twitter differ widely in terms of their positive or negative view on migration, with, for example, Spain being largely very positive, Poland at the other end of the spectrum being very negative, and most countries being somewhere in between with a varying proportion of positive and negative positions. The network of accounts involved in the Europeanization of the digital public discourse is rather polarized. The pro and anti-migration are separate clusters, and there are few to no bridges between them. The anti-migration Twitter network is more dense and more populated by accounts compared to the pro-migration one. And in the pro-migration network, we can see that the European Union accounts seem to play a major role. So this is where I stop in order to allow for hopefully more questions from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Segerstedt. Right before I was lifting the timeout signal, excellent timing. I already see in the chat, I copied some questions from Padlet. They're both addressed to Dr. Van Wollegem and Professor Kapelen. So maybe, Pierre, if you want to start answering these questions, can you see them in the chat?
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Dario.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, okay, I leave it to you.
So the first question is basically about the interaction between administrative capacity and politics, and that's something that regards much more the paper I'm going to present tomorrow. So not so much the presentation I've just given. But very briefly, to answer the question, not to leave it hanging, I would rather, so I'm going to read it just to make sure everyone knows what it talks about. So one of the findings you presented is that the greater the administrative capacity, the lower the governmental intervention in the asylum procedure. Has the reverse been observed in more countries? That is, the greater the government intervention, the more the capacity building shrinks, as competent actors, for instance, UNHCR, are under pressure to withdraw? Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's actually the reason why in WP3 we are collecting lots of data about legal frameworks when it comes to determining refugee status, in order to see how actors are being involved in the decision-making process. So that's something I cannot answer right now. We will need more time to finish the data collection and then to run the analysis. But it's definitely a question that is going to be at the center of the quantitative part of the WP3 work in the forthcoming month. As for the second question was, what do citizens find more serious, granting asylum to someone that doesn't meet all the necessary conditions, or failing to grant someone who meets the necessary conditions? So this has just been posted on Twitter by our fantastic communication responsible. You have it there. And so basically, as the figures stand, about 36.5% of the respondents think that the failure to grant asylum is more serious. So not granting asylum to people that would, in theory, deserve asylum is more serious. And the percentage is about 23.9 when it comes to the other way around. So wrongly granting asylum. You can see the graph on Twitter. I'm hoping that my answer is good enough for the person that asked the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer, Dr. Van Wollegem. Is there any other questions specifically addressed to WP7 and Professor Segersten or Manse especially? I don't see any of them on Padlet for now, nor in the Q&A. If there are no such questions, we can go back to some questions which were addressed to other work packages, but I'll give people a couple minutes to think about questions for WP7. It seems there's no question for now. Anyway, you all have time to post them on Padlet and they will be answered, as I said. Now going back to the questions which were already asked, I have a question from, again, from Shioma in the question and answers, saying it's addressed to Professor Very and Jacobsen. I'm pasting it in the chat and reading it. Could Joe and Christine indicate whether the responses from the government departments are in line with the way migrants and refugees are treated in South Africa? So I guess it's especially to Professor Very, but also Christine is addressed. Please, the floor is yours.
So the main thing at the moment is, as we indicated, is that our fieldwork was, is currently underway. So I don't want to draw any grand claims currently. What, the responses from government departments, so in terms of this research, that is underway at the moment, that piece hasn't been completed. But if I'm getting the question, it's, are they in line with the way that migrants and refugees should be treated, or in the ways that they are treated at the moment? And I think that, hopefully, towards the end of the year into the beginning of next year, we'll be able to have some more concrete responses. But what we are aware of is that the familiarity with the global compacts at the level of sort of ground level governance appears to be quite low. And so the ways in which issues around protection are playing out at the ground level appear not to be being informed by international debates and discussions around the compacts. But obviously in the South African space, we'll be able to talk more to that once the research is completed.
Thank you very much, Professor Very. I'm now pasting a question addressed to WP2, so Professor Gild and Professor Bast especially. It's on the Padlet and I'm pasting it in the chat. I'm reading it as well. Are the national officers, judges, etc., that are meant to translate the political commitments into law aware of these political commitments? It has, that is to say, contents and implications of the global compacts in the course of their work?
Well, I'll start off answering that one by making a plug for our panel tomorrow, because one of the things that we're doing in Work Package 2 is a handbook for public officials, judges, lawyers, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants on how the compact, in particular the Global Compact on Refugees, but also the Marrakesh Compact on Migrants, needs to be applied to bring the common European asylum system into conformity with the commitments of EU governments under those two compacts. So we're working on a handbook that's very specific, looking at each of the instruments and looking at the problematic provisions of each instrument and how that needs to be interpreted and applied at the national level to ensure that that political commitment of states is transposed into national law. So come to the session tomorrow and you can ask us all about that work.
Thank you very much, Professor Gild. The last question already on Padlet is actually the one I already read earlier, but refer to Work Package 2. So again, what does PROTECT hope to achieve with the findings of the research? It was asked already. So in case we want to jump to the general discussion, this will help leading toward it. We have almost 50 minutes. I think we might close earlier, and then we will have the keynote speech by Professor Hathaway. In the meanwhile, I'm very glad to be able to give back the time I took from the panelists. Thank you very much for being so helpful in sticking to the timeline. We happen to have some time for a general discussion. So whomever from the panel wants to elaborate on things which have been said or any other question, they are all welcome and fitting at this time. As I said, we have more than 40 minutes. So I see some signs of Zoom fatigue lingering included on myself. But if you do have things you want to say at this point, you are absolutely welcome to do it. And we have some free and open time to do so. The floor is to the panelists.
Can I start there, Dario? Because I think that it's all too easy to say that there are countries which disregard migrants and refugees' rights. Because you may have some ministry, for instance, an interior ministry, which is very reluctant to deliver on what it sees as commitments made by the foreign ministry to the global compacts. But then you may have justice ministries, which are very interested in rule of law. You'll have foreign ministries, which are very concerned about the reputation of the state in the international community. And we're seeing a proliferation of what is now being called migration diplomacy in respect of international obligations or non-compliance with obligations. You're going to have CSOs, which are very concerned, faith-based groups, a whole series of actors that are all working together, including judges, including lawyers, etc. So I think that before you answer that question, you need to disaggregate the state.
Maybe I can also add yet another thought, slightly going back to Madeleine's question of whether the Global Compact for Migration might actually undermine existing legal commitments under human rights law. Actually, oftentimes, it's not only about whether or not commitments made will be observed, but there's also a permanently ongoing discussion what actually the content of commitments is. So in every important judgment by the European Court of Human Rights, it's not only about whether the respondent state has actually violated the law in this particular case, but most often we are interested in that cases because the court develops the law, it adds meaning to what, it clarifies what actually the content of the obligations is. And there is, I see in this regard, important contributions by the Global Compact for Migration, because at some points, contrary what Madeleine has suggested, the level of protection suggested by the Global Compact for Migration seems to be higher than what is common sense under the binding commitments. For example, in the context of immigration detention, the Global Compact for Migration without qualification requires that such measures may only be taken as a measure of last resort, meaning a proportionality test has always to be conducted. Whereas the European Court of Human Rights is of the opinion that in the context of border-related procedures, such a proportionality test does not have to be conducted in every case. So in the future debate, whether measures, for example, by the European Union in the context of border procedures, immigration detention measures taken in the context of border procedures are actually violations of the law, the Global Compact may be of much help in order to make the case that such measures as envisioned by the European Union do not live up to the commitment to observe human rights law.
Can I add something to this, Dario? The legal perspective that Elspeth and Jürgen have been using here is always very useful and enlightening. I would like to add the politics perspective to that, to the issue of whether the initiatives that are motivated by the Global Compact could weaken the status of the Geneva Convention and the other international law that are used to protect refugees. Well, there was a tendency to that in the beginning in the political landscape. When the Global Compact on migration and on refugees were announced before they were approved by the UN General Assembly, some nativist groups in different countries tried to use this opportunity in order to turn back the development towards refugee protection ideals that we have had up to now. They saw this as an opportunity to reopen the discussion about whether we need to comply with international law. And they managed to mobilize really many people, even in a country like Norway, and leave aside countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and these Visegrad countries that are more inclined to such views. So politically, there was an inclination towards using the Global Compact as a means to put the Geneva Convention into question, whether we should have the international community decide about our migration rules and refugee protection rules, which should be a national issue. And this discussion really came into the agenda in many places. But I would agree with Jürgen and Elspeth that in legal terms, this would not make much difference because the Global Refugee Compact is also already declaring its allegiance to the Refugee Convention, and it's adding an international solidarity and burden sharing element to it. That was actually what was lacking in international law and in the practice of the Geneva Convention, the burden sharing and international solidarity element. And I think the UNHCR's or the United Nations, I will say, strategy here is very useful because they did not make it obligatory, which would attract a lot of resistance from different political groups around the world, especially in this situation that I explained in my own presentation. But like always, such international organizations start initiatives and expect others to gather around those initiatives and contribute to it. And in the process, and more states and countries will be socialized into the idea of burden sharing and international solidarity. So it's a long path towards achieving this, but it's a path that has been opened. So in that sense, in my opinion, it will strengthen the international refugee protection regime.
Thank you very much for this exchange on the legal analysis and beyond. As I said, we have time for an open discussion. So I see Professor Kasteker willing to intervene, maybe, please.
Yep. Thank you for giving me the floor. I just want to add what Elspeth Gill said, that the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been very important at the beginning of the international refugee regime, the Convention of Geneva, when the Convention of Geneva, which was very much a creation of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, came into life, came into existence. It was in several countries in Europe, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who was in charge of refugee policy. And it's only in the 1980s, starting with the Schengen Agreement, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been marginalized in the whole discussion on immigration, on the whole discussion on refugee protection. So the compact is a way for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to re-enter in the scene in which they have been marginalized because immigration has become an important domestic issue and more public order has been more important in managing migration. But the Global Compact is now a mean to re-enter on the scene and to revigorate this attention towards cooperation, international cooperation, and the international refugee regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Castecker. We also have a question from Dr. Madeleine Garlick in the chat, which seems a very promising anticipation of the debate for tomorrow's fora. But as I said, we have time to start addressing it now. It's referred to Professor Bast. Thank you, Jürgen. I agree with your analysis, but I was also expecting that you might be able to confirm that the GCR and the GCM were relevant as boosted standards were correctly applied. Some had argued that the failure to repeat verbatim in the compacts the commitments from international treaties created scope for undermining. But would the WP2, I guess, support the idea that, on the contrary, complementary elements addressed in the compacts are needed to ensure clarity on how to fulfill international obligations? It reminds me of the reading by Chimney, of the very, very critical reading of the compacts. Please, if anyone wants to jump in.
Just briefly, that I would support Madeleine's conclusion. So procedures and institutions are crucial to give meaning to substantive commitments, and therefore also in the context of the refugee compact, the fact that this particular document in itself is not really loaded with individual rights does not necessarily weaken the Geneva Refugee Convention. Well, hopefully they can complement each other, so we still have the Geneva Refugee Convention as a source of rights for refugees, while the Global Compact may help to fill the gap of the lacking solidarity mechanisms, which is not provided for in the Geneva Refugee Convention. So therefore, the idea that they may be of complementary nature is something which I would support.
Can I just add there that I think that Jürgen's absolutely right. We must bear in mind the complementary nature. A complementary nature can never be one which reduces standards. That would be anathema, and it would be contrary to principles of international law, of which, Jürgen, you know infinitely more than I do. But a subsequent agreement, a subsequent multilateral agreement, which is not even in the form of a protocol in international law, cannot undermine, as I understand it, the principles of international law. But could you explain that a little bit further? Because you're the great professor on international law, not me.
No, you, as far as I know, you're absolutely right, Elspeth. You don't have to, you hide yourself.
Yeah, if I recall from Chimney's criticism, he was worried that the compact could be read as part of subsequent state practice in accordance with the Vienna Convention of the Law Treaties. But I just dropped that there. Here we have the leading experts about the team about this very controversial topic. So and I see anyway, everyone is welcome to ask other questions, or again, our experts are welcome to elaborate on something they said. In the meanwhile, I remind you all that we are reconvening at 5:30 European time, 11:30 Canadian time, for the keynote address by Professor Hathaway. Again, the conversation is ongoing on Padlet, and you are most welcome, especially our experts. We've already forced you to condense results and insights from 1.5 years of PROTECT and sometimes decades of research outside of the project into very brief presentations. If you want to make a further effort and tweet about the discussion, you are encouraged to do so. You can also tweet through the PROTECT account by sending your messages to our communication coordinator, Marilyn Daide. Yes, we do stay in this room, and if there is no other question, I want to thank enormously our panelists and all who intervened. It's been a real effort, as I said, to put this rich and complex research into an accessible conversation. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. You can see more in the videos online. They are really worth watching. And again, please interact with these great panelists on Padlet. They are all provoked by your questions and can answer them either during the conference or later. Thank you very much to the public, to everyone who intervened, to the panelists, to the organizer. I give the floor back to Professor Atak, and I think we're approaching the break.
Oh, thank you, Dario. I don't have anything else to add, but thank our panelists and also those who asked questions and participated in the discussion. As you said, we will reconvene in half an hour. And Professor Hathaway will be joining us for the keynote lecture. Thank you. And so please use the same join link. We will be in the same room, and see you in half an hour. Thank you.